Whether you're joining a Product Marketing Alliance event for the first time, or if you're a seasoned regular, welcome to Masters of Product Marketing 2022. We have an awesome lineup of leadership-focused content for you to enjoy over the next 2 days. But before we dive in, I just want to say a few thank yous. Thank you to our sponsor partners, insightful speakers, and of course you, our lovely audience. From wherever in the world you are watching, we hope you enjoy the sessions. To get the most out of these talks, please ensure you are sharing your feedback and asking your questions in the comments section, as our speakers will be answering them throughout the day. After the event, a great place to continue the conversation is in the PMA Slack community. If you aren't already a member, hop on over and join the discussions. And if that's still not enough, then why not become a PMA member and benefit from unlimited access to exclusive templates, frameworks, meetups, mentors, and our entire library of videos and slide decks from all our events. So with all that to come, let's dive right into the next session.
So you can imagine that this topic is really close to my heart. And over the years, I've thought a lot about codifying how you can find your way into a PMM career. And then I've also found that the same principles will help you grow once you're inside a PMM career. So I'm kind of curious to understand how many of you that are watching this session live right now, if you can throw into the chat, are you already in PMM and you're looking to grow? Or are you outside of the PMM function and you're just trying to find your way into the PMM function? Because that will be kind of a healthy barometer for us to work off of. And I'll keep going ahead. There are two things that we're going to cover today that I think are the foundations of any career conversation I have with someone looking to grow in PMM. The first thing I always cover is, hey, what are the core jobs to be done in product marketing? And the second thing I then cover is, what are the skill sets that you need to master to be able to go do those jobs really effectively? And so we're going to cover both of those things today. Let's start with the first one, which is what are the core jobs to be done in product marketing? Because I get asked this question all the time. And typically the question gets asked as, hey, what's the day-to-day look like for a PMM? Hey, what does this job description mean when it says all of these different things? And so that's what I'm going to break down really quick for you in a slide. So if you think about the jobs to be done in product marketing, I'm sure you hear these words floating around on job descriptions. You'll hear words like inbound marketing. Then you'll hear words like outbound go-to-market. And then you'll also hear about a bunch of foundational jobs to be done, like how do you measure metrics? How do you track performance once you've launched something? And so basically what I've done here is I've just kind of codified those into inbound, outbound, and foundational jobs to be done. But importantly, then I break them down and unpack them a little bit so you understand what they really mean. And so here they are. Let's start with our inbound jobs to be done in product marketing. A lot of you might already know this, but when you're working in product marketing, a large part of your job is to influence the product roadmap. So you're building out features that your customers really need, and that'll solve their problems. But to be able to do that thing that we call influencing the product roadmap, which is on row 2 here, the first step you need to be able to take is to be able to turn the intelligence that's coming in into insights. And when I say intelligence coming in, I mean from 3 sources. Number 1, your customers, what's the input you're hearing from them? Number 2, the market, what's happening in your category and market landscape that is evolving, that needs to influence the products you develop. And number 3, competitive intelligence. What are your competitors doing? So even if you meet the customer's needs in a way that lines up with the market environment, you're still doing it in a way that is differentiated and superior versus your competitors. So those tend to be typically the 3 sources of intelligence. And I think a large part of the inbound job to be done is taking all of those incoming inputs and turning them into insight that can then actually influence the product roadmap. And then the third piece in inbound, I would say, is then aligning a bunch of different cross-functional teams towards launching that product feature or a product itself. The reason this is important, you can't just work with a product team to develop features and to sell them out to customers. There's a whole bunch of other things that need to happen. You need to figure out how you're going to communicate those features through scaled marketing. You need to figure out how your lifecycle marketing is going to then communicate that at different points, like onboarding and renewal. You also need to figure out whether your customer success teams are set up for success for when the product goes into a customer's hand. And all of those things need to be orchestrated and coming together towards a launch moment. I'd say those are the three most important jobs to be done when you're thinking about a product marketing career. Next is the outbound jobs to be done. A lot of you are probably familiar with these, but I want to break them down and codify them anyway. The first one, the ability to position your product so you can talk about what it does to solve the customer's problem. The second one, the ability to message that in a really concise, consistent, and competitive way to your customer. And number three, what we call narratives. So what is the overarching storyline that you're sending out to the market through any thought leadership, through your sales pitch decks? All of them have to have a certain cohesion that underlies them. And that needs to be derived from the positioning and the core messaging. And so one big part of the outbound job to be done is the ability to put down great positioning, outbound messaging, and narrative work that faces your customers and your field teams. Which brings me to the second one. When you're pulling together narratives, pitch decks, things like that for your field teams, by field teams, I really mean your sales reps, as well as your customer success organization, how do you now make sure that they not only know where to find these pitch decks and narratives, but they also feel really fluent in speaking to them in a very customer-centric and very solution-centric way, rather than just describing and rattling off the features of your product. And so getting your field to a high level of competency with being able to sell is a really important part of the outbound PMM job. And the third one is customer-facing go-to-market motions. How do you make sure there is a big launch moment where you're communicating the core messaging to your customers, where you're telling them why this is important to them and how it's going to solve a problem for them? How do you think about channel strategy, and so on and so forth? And then finally, there's a big foundational job to be done in product marketing, which is once you've launched something, or even before you launch something, the ability to set what success metrics look like. And then once you've launched, the ability to track and measure those success metrics so you can then do a better job refining and iterating on your next launch. And this one is a really critical job to be done. It sort of runs through the life cycle of being a PMM. That's the slide I have for you all on the core jobs to be done in product marketing. And I'm sure there are many flavors to this. I'm sure that in the chat, you can probably add for me a bunch of things that I'm completely overlooking, or a bunch of things that are subsumed within these categories. But at a high level, if you're thinking about, well, what does a product marketing job look like? Here are the things that happen on a day-to-day basis in a PMM job. With that, I'm going to move on to what are the skill sets then that you need to master or demonstrate to be able to show that you can get these jobs done in a PMM role. This is an important one because as a workforce and an economy, we are slowly moving more and more to talking about skills that matter rather than talking about your pedigree or your experience in the past. And so when you're interviewing for a company that's relatively open-minded, they're not fixated on where you come from and what you've done before, but they're more fixated on the skills and whether you have them or not. It's going to be really easy to demonstrate some of these competencies because you may have already done these things in your prior roles. And that gives you a really easy avenue then to show that you have transferable skills to enter a PMM role. And so let's go talk about what these skill sets are. I typically classify the skill sets that are critical to product marketing into 5 big categories. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these categories. And while I'm doing that, I'm also going to get a bit of a time check going for myself. All right, so let's jump in. The first one, customer empathy. The second, the ability to distill intelligence into insight. The third, that vague, ambiguous, very nebulous bucket called strategic thinking. But not to worry, I'm going to break it down for you today. The fourth is also a relatively nebulous category called problem solving. And the fifth, I think this is the most important of all in any work that you do that involves cross-functional partnerships, it's communication and influence. Sometimes this gets bucketed under this big umbrella label called collaboration. And so we're going to talk a little bit about unpacking each of these and saying, hey, what does it look like to master these skill sets? Let's start with customer empathy. And before I talk about the details of customer empathy, I want you to think of a time in your career ever where your team got really excited because your R&D teams or your technology teams were able to come up with this amazing technology that they thought would be world-changing. It would make your product function so much better. It was just so cool. You were the first ones to come up with it. And you get so focused in on how this technology is so superior that everything from building your product to launching your product centers in how that technology is so cool. And not once have you given any thought to, does the customer even care? I remember going through this example when I was at a tech company once in my career. We chanced upon this technology that was like Bluetooth activated notifications to customers when they're near retail stores. It was a pretty cool thing. And we were just so fixated on how cool it was. We didn't stop to think, is this something that customers need? Importantly, is this something customers even want? As you can imagine, when we went out and did customer interviews, the idea was a bit of a dud. Customers were overarchingly bearish on the idea, which is to say, they said, I don't want your notifications. I don't care if you have a cool technology. This is not an actual problem I need solved. And in fact, I'm really worried you're going to spam me. And that put an end to that project. So what do you do to make sure you don't find yourself in that situation? And what does customer empathy really mean? So the first one, if you're able to anchor any product development or messaging in what are the customer jobs to be done in that category that you operate in, and which of those jobs to be done are either underserved or unserved by the competition, that is always a really great place to start to figure out what is it that you really want to solve for the customer. Number two, the customer journey. That's another framing to figure out what you can solve for your customer, which is from the moment the customer starts interacting with your product. Let's say from the moment they buy your product, and if it is a B2B SaaS product, then the moment they buy the product to the moment their users start onboarding, to the moment their users get used to working with the product and ramp, to the moment that you then go in for a renewal conversation. Where along this journey are your users as well as your buyers feeling the most friction? That can be really fertile territory from which great product ideas can emerge. And the third one, never forget the goal of everything that you're doing when you're building a product, you're delivering messaging, is you are helping the customer justify renewing their contract with you year on year. Because really in B2B SaaS businesses, the way things work is if you deliver value to the customer, they are more motivated to renew with you, and that's how you make revenue. And so never forget that your goal is to give them such a great experience with your product throughout the journey that at the end, they can justify renewing their contract with you. And so for customer empathy, I'd always ask you to anchor in these three things, the three J's, as I call them, the jobs to be done that are unserved or underserved, the customer journey and where there's pain along that journey. And number three, help them justify renewing their contract with your business next year by delivering tons of value along the way. That's customer empathy. And I would love to hear in the chat any other ideas you have that help you build the skill set around customer empathy. And as we hear your thoughts, I'm going to move on to the next critical skill set, the ability to distill from intelligence to insight. I want to ask you, have you ever sat through a long presentation where somebody's throwing insight after insight after insight at you? There's information about how the market is moving and what the customer is saying, and you're just like getting so much from them. But when you leave that meeting, you have zero clarity on what you're meant to do differently moving forward. That's what I call an overload and an abundance of information, but zero insight that actually influences action. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you make sure that does not happen to you. How do you make sure you're always focused on distilling incoming input and intelligence to turn it into insight that then drives action? Number one, like I said earlier, remember that incoming intelligence can come from any or all of these three sources: the customer, the market, and the competition. And so remember that you're going to get all of this input from these different sources. And so a lot of the magic is going to happen when you're able to pull that together and you're able to analyze it with a couple of guiding principles. So number one is think about the context in which all of that is coming together. Think about the context in which each of those inputs was collected. What I mean by context is if you spoke to your customers 3 weeks ago, when we felt like we were all in a recessionary environment, you're going to have picked up a lot of fear and anxiety. If your market intelligence was picked up 6 months ago when we were in a really bullish market, you have to remember that the context in which you collected those two inputs are very different from each other. And then you have to ask yourself, what is the context that is really relevant to the decision I'm trying to make? If it is the recency and the environment we're in right now, you want to place greater emphasis on that customer input that you got recently versus the market intelligence that you picked up 6 months ago. So that's what I mean by context. The next big part of analysis and distillation is you're looking for common patterns across all of the input you're getting, because those common patterns are going to be the essence of the insights that you drive. And number three, you're also looking for interesting outliers that are significant enough to report on, but they're outliers for a good reason. For example, you're collecting intelligence globally, but you're noticing that your European markets, they're just operating a little bit differently from the rest of the globe, or they have additional needs and nuances from the rest of the globe. You want to make sure that when you're distilling into insight, you call out not just the big patterns that are common across regions, but also a couple of the outliers that you need to watch out for in specific regions. So that's how you think a little bit about analysis when you're distilling stuff. And how do you think about synthesis? Like synthesis is how do you pull it all together? So people that are walking away from your presentation, for example, know exactly what to do. I love this framework known as the what, the so what, and the now what. The what is all of the stuff that you're collecting, what you're learning. The so what is, well, what does that mean exactly? What is the underlying pattern that we're learning from this? And the now what is hence, what should various teams be doing differently to act on that insight? And you can see that having a clear so what and having a clear now what is incredibly important. So the teams you're presenting to can walk away with clear action steps. And it becomes a lot easier then to drive alignment and action across cross-functional teams. So that's what I have for you on the skill set of distilling intelligence to insight. Think about incoming inputs. Think about how you want to analyze them. And then finally, remember to synthesize into the so what and the now what. With that, let's move into the third one. In my opinion, strategic thinking is talked about so often, and yet people are rarely able to break down for us what exactly that means. I want to hear in the chat from you all, how many times have you been told that you need to be, quote unquote, more strategic in the way that you think, and you had absolutely no idea what it meant? Or that when you asked, you did not get a clear enough answer? I'm willing to bet it's many, many, many of you, because this is ambiguous territory. So let's try and break down strategic thinking a little bit. At a very high level, before I even put something on the slide, strategy is basically choice making. So if I say, what does the word strategy mean? It just means there are possibly several ways to get to an end goal. And strategy is the process of identifying which of those approaches to get to your end goal is going to be the most effective and the most efficient. Hence, that is the one that you should be pursuing. It's really as simple as that. Just remember, strategy is choice making. And sometimes you're making macro level choices. For example, you're leading a team of PMMs, or you're working on your OKRs or your priorities for the quarter, and you're asking yourself, what should I focus on? And sometimes you're thinking about this at a more micro level. You're thinking, hey, I'm already working on this project. And in my project, my role is to optimize how this product works. In that context, strategic thinking will show up as, what part of this product do I really want to solve for? Where do I want to focus my attention on? So a lot of strategic thinking is about making choices on where you will focus your attention to begin with, and then making choices on how you will go about accomplishing that outcome that you've chosen to focus your attention on. So let's break this down a little bit. The first thing, super critical to strategic thinking, is developing business acumen. What does that mean exactly? Two things. One, do you understand in the organization that you work for how your business makes money? So unless you understand how your business generates revenue, you will not have clarity on which of the levers that then help generate that revenue are within scope of your team's influence. Here's a really simple example. I work in product marketing. I work on the talent business. Perhaps the way that my business generates revenue is, the more customers that renew their contracts with us, the more revenue we can generate. Then I think to myself, well, what's the lever that drives that? The lever that drives that my team influences is how much value is our product delivering to our customers from when they purchase it to when renewal comes up. And that then helps me go, okay, how can my team help influence the value that our customers are getting out of our product? And that's a really powerful question to ask because it directly guides the OKRs for my team. But if I don't have clarity on which levers drive the business, but are also influenceable by my team, I have no idea where to start. So the first skill set within strategic thinking, develop business acumen, understand how your business makes money, and understand which of your team's levers influence those business levers that make money for the company. Number two, once you know what levers you can control to drive business revenue, that makes it easy for you to figure out what are the outcomes at a team level that will then drive business outcomes. And then it becomes very easy to say, those are the outcomes that I'm going to pick to identify key work streams and projects. So for example, if I said, I want to be able to deliver value to the customer throughout their journey, perhaps the way that shows up on my team's OKRs is I might say, I think we need a project that understands where in the customer experience the biggest pain lies and which of those are the most important for us to go solve. Because if we do that, we can deliver value. And if we deliver value, that can generate more renewals. So this is what I call the outcomes orientation. Get really clear on what's the end outcome that your team is working towards and use that to pick work streams and projects for your team. And then, you're always going to come up with a bunch of different ways you can drive to those outcomes. This is where strategy becomes choice making. Ask yourself, which are the choices that can truly help deliver those desired outcomes? But also ask yourself, and we'll talk about this a little later, what is the impact of these various choices versus the relative effort that you would put into making those choices? And that impact versus effort framework will tell you how you want to make prioritization and trade-offs between all the possible things that you can solve, because you can never solve everything. This to me is like the essence of strategic thinking. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. If there's anything big around strategic thinking that perhaps I'm glossing over, missing, that you found is really important to being an effective PMM. Let me keep moving on from strategic thinking to the next big one, problem solving. Like I said, this is another very ambiguous skill set that gets talked about a lot, and I want to try and break this down for you today. So with problem solving, I think the first stage or skill set that you want to be able to learn is, how do you even know something is a problem? And how do you know that it's a problem worth focusing on? And I think a lot of the underlying essence here is, like we said earlier, you know what levers of the business your team directly influences. Because you understand these levers really closely, for example, value delivery through the customer life cycle, you are also best poised to understand when one of those levers is not working really well. This is what I call critical indicators that a problem even exists. Sometimes it may be feedback that you're getting from customers. And sometimes it could be that a lot of your customer success representatives are saying, hey guys, we're getting this question over and over again, and we don't really know how to answer our customers. This is what I call looking out for critical symptoms and critical indicators that a problem even exists in the first place. So knowing what to look for, knowing what is indicating to you that there's something deep down that's problematic and worth solving. Second part of this, having the judgment to distinguish between a symptom and a root cause. What the customer is telling you, that seems to be a symptom. But once you dig a little bit deeper, you might uncover that the real problem is something else, and that's what's the root cause. And then the last part of problem identification is, sometimes you're going to be faced with really big, ambiguous, gnarly problems that feel like, where do I even start to solve this? And what can really help in these cases is to break that down into a couple of subproblems. So like I said earlier, let's say you're hearing a lot of feedback about poor customer experience. It can help to go, well, how does that feedback map out across the various stages of the customer journey? Because at least then you can go, oh, I have a couple of big things that are coming up at onboarding, but there are a couple of other really big things that are coming up when customers are trying to use this very specific feature. And now you've just broken down a really big problem into 2 sub-problems. That's just going to make it much easier for you to fix it. So that's a stage 1, problem identification. Stage 2 is what I call hypothesis-driven analysis. And I would highly encourage you for, by the way, all of these problem categories to go look for courses within the PMA, which is the Product Marketing Alliance, or even other learning platforms to develop these skill sets. I bet there are courses that are labeled exactly these things that will teach you how to do this effectively. What is hypothesis-driven analysis? It's when you identified a problem, you are then able to break down what are the possible things that might be driving the problem, which is to say, what are the possible root causes that are driving a symptom? Because then you can go focus on finding evidence to either prove or disprove that each of those root causes is really a root cause. And that then helps you zero in on what are the 1 or 2 root causes that are seriously driving this problem. Hence, those are the things we need to focus on fixing. Because very often what happens in organizations is you see a problem and you just run after solving the problem. You don't pause to ask yourself, is this a symptom? Is this a root cause? And you don't stop to ask yourself, it's a symptom. Am I solving for the right root causes? Or am I solving for whatever the lowest hanging root cause is? And by the way, this is the root cause of overwork in PMM lives, is that we go after every problem instead of being strategic about the ones that really matter. Finally, we talked about how to identify a problem. We talked about how to analyze a problem. And in talking about how to move to a solution, like step 1 is always, you want to try and focus your energy on resolving the root causes that you have proven are actually driving the issue. So where you actually have evidence that this is a real root cause worth solving. But importantly, if you uncover a bunch of them that are causing the problem, this is where you use a prioritization framework, like what is the relative impact of addressing this root cause versus the relative effort that we'll need to put into solving it. And this is a really important one because you might have things that are super high impact and really low effort. You want to go after those things first, but there could also be things that are really low impact and high effort. And then you have to ask yourself, is this really worth the team's time? So key to problem solving, get good at identifying problems, get good at distinguishing between symptoms and root causes. Number 2, hypothesis-driven analysis, get good at parsing out which root causes are truly driving the problem. And number 3, get good at prioritizing which validated root causes you really want to go after using the impact versus effort prioritization framework. I'm keen to hear what else you've seen as being really effective at driving great problem solving in your teams. Feel free to throw that into the chat. And this is the last category I'm going to talk about before we jump straight into questions. Like I said earlier, this overarching bucket that we call collaboration tends to be the most critical skill set to be able to succeed in PMM. Why? Because product marketing tends to be an influencer for a lot of decisions. We are not decision makers for a bunch of things. We don't make the call on what product features get built. We make a recommendation. We don't make the call on what the field should be enabled on. A lot of our sales leaders make those decisions. And so often we're in a role where we have the strongest insight on our customers, but we don't have the authority to go do those things. Instead, we have to influence other partners to go do those things. And this is why our ability to communicate effectively and our ability to influence without authority become incredibly important. Let me talk a little bit about each of these and just know that these are big problem spaces. And there's so much great learning out there on both communication and influence, but I've tried to hit on the greatest hits of the skill sets that matter. So with communication, I don't know how many of you have heard about what's known as the pyramid principle, but the pyramid principle, also known as the exit principle, is basically to say that if you are doing any verbal or written communication, your key headlines should be super clear so that if that is all that somebody hears or reads, and then they walk away, they should still be super clear on the three things that really matter. So the pyramid principle in writing means have clear headers, communicate in bullets as far as you can, highlight the things that really matter, and try not to put more than 2 or 3 things as key recommendations. You want to make sure that the person you're communicating with really absorbs 2 or 3 key things and walks away from that meeting. So that's a pyramid principle. You'll find a lot of literature out there on this principle. I'd say go look at it, see all the courses available. This has been incredibly critical to my own career growth over the last 15 years. The next communication principle I think of is what I call what's the so what. In fact, there's a product leader from LinkedIn. His name is James Raybould, and he used to do a newsletter called What's the So What? And he used to summarize the so what from big books, basically things like Think Again, because he wanted to be able to distill books down to their essence so the audience could walk away with, well, so what do I do differently? Always ask yourself when you're communicating something, is the so what clear to your audience? And ideally, your so what should be some of the headers and the key bullets that you are prioritizing using the pyramid principle. I think the third part of communication that happens in a lot of asynchronous communication like meetings is the ability to really listen with an open mind, and then the ability to ask really powerful questions as a follow-up. When you are truly curious, you're going to feel motivated to seek to understand where someone else is coming from. The more you seek to understand, the more clarity you will have. The more clarity you have, the more you can reconcile conflicting sources of information or conflicting points of views. So a really critical skill set within communication is the ability to listen effectively and to ask questions with genuine curiosity. And with that, I'm going to move into influence. Like I said, influence is a really big part of the PMM job. And there are 3 big elements to this. The first one is what I call architecting buy-in. Very simply put, this means that if you are working towards a big moment where you're going to get a bunch of important people in a room and you're going to make a recommendation you want them to act on, you want to make sure that you have architected their buy-in well before that final meeting. Meaning you understand what these people are trying to optimize for in their jobs. You try and understand how your recommendation is going to help them achieve their goals more successfully. You prime them ahead of the meeting, or you speak to people that have influence over these people, and you're able to get alignment and buy-in even before you enter the big meeting. This is the essence of how consulting firms work. So that final meeting is just a chance to refine the recommendation, but to a large extent, you've socialized and primed people for the recommendation even before you go into the room. If there's one thing you walk away with, that's the one I would say you should walk away with for influence, is the ability to prime your stakeholders and architect buy-in before the big conversation. The second aspect of influence is what I call difficult conversations. You're often going to run into people who don't agree with your point of view. I did a podcast on this topic recently. So if you go to my profile and you check out one of my recent posts, it talks about this podcast on difficult conversations. And no, it's not just a shameless plug. You can also go to any learning platform and figure out how to learn how to have really difficult conversations effectively. But the key here is the ability to, again, listen, ask good questions, keep an open mind, don't get attached to your beliefs, and focus on the common goal between you and the stakeholder that are in disagreement with each other. The final thing I want to say about influence is, you know how sometimes you've made this amazing presentation, you have a lot of data, and all the analysis and all the numbers show that people should do one thing. And yet you're noticing that the leaders in the room are just fixated on doing this whole other thing. What's going on there? What's going on is numbers and data influence what I call head level thinking. You're able to influence people's intellect using data, but you cannot influence people's hearts and their guts, which is where a lot of decisions get made using just data. This is where the power of storytelling really comes in. And I know that there was a session on storytelling just before this. So when you're thinking about influencing other partners, the first thing you need to try and understand is where are they emotionally, psychologically, and how far are they from the recommendation that you are trying to make? If the distance between your recommendation and their current belief is really large, then the amount of storytelling that you need to do is proportionately large. So your focus cannot be on showing the numbers. The focus needs to be on customer stories and the storytelling that tells them why this is so important. And then you're then able to bring them along on the journey. So focus not just on influencing the head, but also on influencing the heart and the gut of your stakeholders. And that's mainly it, you folks, for all of the skill sets that I think are really critical to thriving in PMM. As we open up for questions through Rose, I want to leave you with this one slide, which is, I did a really simple mapping of the jobs to be done that I talked about earlier, and the skill sets that I then started to talk about, to let you know which of these skill sets correspond to being able to do some of these jobs to be done in PMM. And so you can start to see where across these jobs you're going to have to apply some of these skill sets. And you can also see clearly that customer empathy and the ability to communicate and influence are relevant at every job to be done in PMM. So if you start somewhere, start there. And with that, Rose, I'm going to pause and open it up for questions.
Fantastic session, Sudha. There is plenty of engagement in the chat. So we will dive straight into some questions. But yeah, great to see everybody getting so much out of the session. The first question comes from Pallavi. She says, excellent talk. What are the most important KPIs for a product marketer? Are they related to marketing campaigns or overall business revenue?
Pallavi, that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking. I think the answer it depends on what part of PMM you are in. In a large organization, for example, a lot of these jobs to be done can get spread across multiple teams. And so there are some teams that are more focused on field enablement, but there are other teams that are much more focused on customer communications. So number one is getting clear on what's the scope of your team and what's the focus areas. That then defines the key metrics that you will map for your team. Example, I work in more of a field enablement type function, and we do a lot of narrative work. So a lot of my metrics at the first level are related to whether our reps feel confident about positioning or selling a solution to our customers. But Pallavi, you asked a great question. The reason that metric matters to my team is that then is a surrogate for the ultimate business metric, which is our ability to sell in new bookings and to renew existing bookings with customers. So I know that because that's a metric that really matters, the level my team can influence there is rep confidence and rep fluency. And that's why we focus on like the interim metric. But it's really useful to understand how your team's directly influenceable KPI also then ladders up to a business KPI. It just gives you clarity on why you do what you do.
Absolutely, some great advice there. There's also lots of support for tools like Gong, facilitating some more research, and also talking to customers, lots and lots. So yeah, lots of people agreeing. Also a great understanding that, yeah, product marketing role is much more strategic and deals with influencing a lot more with key stakeholders than more traditional marketing roles. But in terms of another question, are there some good ways to get access to customers? How open are customers to providing feedback or making themselves available for interviews?
This is also an excellent question. It directly maps to how do you develop customer empathy if your customer doesn't want to talk to you. So think about this. If anybody ever reaches out to you and asks for your time, the first question you're going to ask yourself is, well, do I have the time? But really the second question you're going to ask yourself is it going to be worth my time? And what am I getting out of it? This may not be transactional. It may be emotional. Sometimes we hang out with certain friends because they make us feel seen and heard. They give us the space to tell them how we're really feeling. And this is true for customers too. So I think there are two parts to my answer. Number one, no matter your mechanism for how you get customers together and to talk to you, you want to make sure they're getting something out of it too. Whether it's a chance to air what's not working, a chance to influence your roadmap, etc. But you also want to be able to tell them how you're going to close the loop with the input you got from them, because that's really what customers want to know is, I spent my time with you. How is that going to show up in your product roadmap or your go-to-market plans? So that's number one, is just focus on mutual value rather than thinking of it as a way to extract something from your customer. The second part of my answer is, I think you can get really efficient with the mechanisms by which you pull customers together to get their feedback. And I find that scaled mechanisms are always better. What I mean by that is, can you create like a customer advisory board group of customers that you will regularly tap for their insights, but then they also get special previews in return to your product roadmap. This way, you minimize all of the transactional time of sourcing customers repeatedly, and you have your group of customers and you focus on really nourishing that relationship and getting good quality feedback from them. So those are two parts to my answer: mutual value and scalable mechanisms.
That is really, really helpful and a great way to close this session. So thank you very much, Sudha, again, for such a thoughtful and useful talk. And thank you, everybody, for your fantastic engagement. And we have the second half of the Product Marketing Awards announcements coming up. So stay tuned to see who we have crowned our winners.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you, everyone. Bye, folks.
Just wondering, I don't know if there was this thing, but the first was a pink. Was it two separate videos? I thought it was one video.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know. Just in case someone asked.